There's a red squirrel in Norse mythology called Ratatoskr, and when I first read about him, I couldn't stop thinking about the red squirrels I photograph in the forest, and how the myths relate to my red squirrels. Since I came to northern Sweden, I fell in love with the red squirrels. But as I've learnt more about them, seeing them every day has changed that love into something else. When you share a forest with squirrels, especially squirrels that know you and are comfortable with you, you start to notice their curiosity, their confidence, and I've noticed when I'm really quiet and I just listen, the squirrels seem to be everywhere. They're moving on the ground, they're in the trees. Spending so much time with them has made me want to look a little deeper, and I discovered the Norse legend of Ratatoskr. Myths don't appear randomly. By living alongside nature, you start to notice patterns, which then become stories and legends. Before I tell you the story of Ratatoskr, it's important to understand where these myths came from, because they weren't stories created by one person. They were part of a spoken tradition, shared across Scandinavia and passed down through generations through word of mouth and just people chatting, maybe next to a fire. When Christianity spread across Scandinavia, many of these stories disappeared. But we're incredibly lucky that in Iceland they were written down in the 13th century and preserved. These writings, known as the Eddas, captured many of these Norse legends. So when I talk about Ratatoskr, I'm not talking about a new fantastical character. I'm talking about something that was preserved in the 13th century and could be much, much older. And remember, back then, people didn't live in houses. They may have lived in small villages, but they also lived in the forest, and they would share stories to each other about animals and red squirrels. So who is Ratatoskr? Ratatoskr is a red squirrel that comes from Norse mythology. These were stories shaped by long, dark winters and people just getting together to tell stories around a campfire. At the center of these stories is a tree called Yggdrasil, and this tree was the center of many of these stories. The tree was seen to represent the universe itself, and through the roots up to the branches, it connects the worlds. People lived very closely around forests and trees. The idea that everything was connected through a tree would feel completely natural. Animals, of course, played a big role in these myths. Wolves, ravens, eagles, serpents, and squirrels weren't animals that were chosen at random. These were some of the most meaningful creatures in the landscape, and also keystone species. At the very top of the tree lived an eagle. This eagle represented intelligence, wisdom, and vision. And that's where Ratatoskr comes in. Ratatoskr lives in Yggdrasil, the tree. And even his name tells a story. It's thought to come from Old Norse language, rata meaning to gnaw or dig, and toskr meaning mischievous. In Norse mythology, Ratatoskr is seen as the messenger. He runs up and down the tree, carrying messages between the eagle who lives at the top and a creature that lives at the roots, the serpent. The serpent is called Nidhogg, and so Ratatoskr exists between two worlds. Sometimes his messages carry truth, sometimes they carry lies. And the stories never tell us if Ratatoskr is good or bad, just merely that he's a messenger. But he does share information that is very powerful and important. I was recently looking at my website and realised there's not enough squirrels. Thank you Squarespace for sponsoring this video. So I decided to create a dedicated Red Squirrels portfolio. I first duplicated my current portfolio to maintain the style. I uploaded and organized my squirrel photos and added a description. I then deleted the squirrel photos from my original portfolio and added some new wildlife images. I added a drop down so both the squirrel and wildlife portfolio can be linked from the same portfolio tab on the homepage, and voila, I have a dedicated wildlife and red squirrels portfolio. It looks really neat and professional. If you'd like to give Squarespace a go, head to squarespace.com/daniconnorwild and you can save 10% off a new purchase of a website or a domain. When I started reading about Ratatoskr, I thought, what about him is actually rooted from real behaviour of red squirrels? Because squirrels generally aren't quiet animals. Red squirrels have an entire language of sound, and over the years I've been trying to understand what these sounds mean. There are high-pitched squeaks, which mean leave me alone, and they might make these sounds if another squirrel is chasing them, or if a dominant squirrel is coming up to them and they are happily eating. They also make these very funny stomping sounds, which basically means I'm very annoyed right now. There's also a sound that means I've spotted you, you are a threat. And since I've actually hand-reared squirrels, there are even sounds which they make when they're quite happy. And when I used to tickle Rue, she would make these very happy squeaks. And all these sounds, of course, are communication. They are messages to other squirrels or animals in the forest. But squirrels are also prey, which means they survive by listening. They recognise bird alarm calls or alarm calls from other species like deer, and they seem to notice shifts in the forest before they even happen. In that way, they also sit between two worlds or two habitats, gathering information from above where there might be predators such as eagles or goshawks, and predators down below, like a pine marten or even a fox. In the myth, Ratatoskr is running between two predators, the eagle and the serpent, and he carries messages which causes tension between them. That's where the story usually stops. But watching the red squirrels, I wonder whether that tension creates a greater purpose. In the forest, drawing attention to yourself can be strategic. Alarm calling when you see a predator not only tells the rest that there's a predator around, but it's also a squirrel saying to the predator, I've seen you, don't come close. So maybe Ratatoskr isn't spreading chaos. Maybe he's keeping everyone alert and safe. But Ratatoskr isn't the only squirrel to appear in legends. In Celtic mythology, there is a queen called Queen Medb. She is linked with many animals, but she was often described to have a squirrel as a companion that would sit on her shoulder. Squirrels were linked to have foresight and vigilance. Similarly, in old North American traditions, squirrels were seen as watchful animals that were vigilant, and they would warn others to prepare for what was to come. But one of the coolest, I think, is in Japan, flying squirrels were associated with forest spirits. And this makes me just want to research further about all these different stories and legends. But generally, squirrels are seen as symbols of attention and being prepared, and a reminder that survival belongs to those who notice first. Squirrels are rarely rulers or big characters in legends. But how could these people have created these stories about squirrels and about Ratatoskr? Let's bring it back to the squirrel forest. There's one squirrel I've really got to know over the past 5 years, and that squirrel is Buddy. Buddy not only is the biggest squirrel in size, but he's also very gentle. He is rarely aggressive like Sylvie, who will chase all the other squirrels, but the other squirrels do move out of his way, almost to avoid conflict. The thing I notice about Buddy is he seems to spend so much time everywhere. He's on the ground, busy caching. The other day he cached around 20 hazelnuts in a couple of hours. He's also in the trees, and sometimes he just disappears for days on end, and I think something's happened to him, but then he just returns like nothing's happened. But the thing that's always surprised me is he's the only squirrel that seems to look me in the eyes, like he's trying to share a message. So as I've got to know Buddy over the years, I completely understand how those people could create stories and legends about squirrels, because I've created my own little stories and ideas about Buddy, and maybe one day I'll write a storybook and Buddy will feature as one of the main characters. What I love about these legends is it gives so much more importance to the animals. We often hear about ravens and wolves, but not so much about the smaller animals like the squirrels. It's amazing to think the creators of these stories lived in nature every day, so these animals weren't just creatures in a distant forest, they were neighbours. I also just love how the centre of the story is the Yggdrasil, the tree. In Norse mythology, the world was held together by this tree, this ancient ash tree, Yggdrasil. Unfortunately, ash trees are actually disappearing and they're endangered now. Unfortunately, there's none around here because I would have loved to film one for this video. Maybe these myths weren't just stories from the past. Maybe they were reminders of what happens when we pay attention to nature. And maybe the magic they describe is still here, just waiting to be noticed. I hope you've enjoyed this video, something a bit different and fun. I'm going to warm up next to the fire and go home.